Morning, everybody. I'm glad to see so many of you. I think the weather kept the not so committed away, Just fine, no judgment, just stating facts. Yeah, it's good to be here. There are a couple announcements I want to work in here before I jump into the teaching, and that is February 24th is our annual meeting. You are all welcome, whether you're a member or not a member. If you want to become a member, which is really, it's the best thing that will ever happen to you. Come February 24th, you can join the rest of us. It's a little bit of a celebration. It's a little bit of looking forward. Also details and voting on the leadership here, the Board of Trustees, and financial updates, and all kinds of other behind-the-scenes stuff that we don't often talk about. Please come to the meeting. It will be fun, I promise you, or fun enough. I promise. So that's coming, and I want to work in something else too, which we'll talk about at the annual meeting. We want to do something a little bit different in the month of March. Instead of talk back, we're going to get together and put our collective creativity in the room together to dream about the future of C3 in a sense of what ideas do you have? What would you like to see happen? And we have a whole process we'll go through over a series of weeks to narrow some of those ideas down, and hopefully at the end of it have just some fresh forward-thinking ideas. But we thought instead of sort of a top-down approach, we'd take the opposite, which is sort of let's get everybody's voice in the room and then sort of work our way towards some things that we can come around. So I think that's really exciting. That's coming in March. Also, if you want to learn more about it, come to the annual meeting. Don't miss it. But one reason why I'm mentioning it now is because if in the back of your mind you have ideas about what could C3 look like, or what sort of things should C3 be into, what kind of things should we be pursuing, what kind of organization should we be partnering with, if anything just occurs to you sort of just like in the back of your mind, start keeping track of it and mull on it, contemplate it, because that's the kind of thing we want you to bring forth in March during the talk back time. Have I made sense enough? Okay. One other thing is that every week we try to remember to say that this place can't exist without your generosity. And it has actually been an incredible year. We'll say more about that at the end. Making this place happen from a financial point of view and from a service point of view. So thank you. But we often forget to say there are donation bins in the back, and every week it's a struggle to remember. So we just decided to make some changes. We're going to keep the boxes in the back, but we're going to go back to the old school way of passing around the basket, because it just plants a little reminder, and that way we're not saying it each week. So in case you're surprised during the song after my talk, just giving you a little warning, a basket will be coming in front of you. So yeah, those are my announcements. So, okay, I've got a lot to do. I was thinking about MLK Day on Monday. And one thing I thought, I was wondering what Martin Luther King Jr. would think of having the day off of school as a way of, I just thought, that just occurred to me as a thought. I wonder what he would think of that. And that got me thinking about leaders and elders. And I mean elder as a kind of archetype, because I think he is an elder, a leader. He was a prophetic voice for sure, but more than that. And I thought, what would it look like to contemplate his words? That's why all of the words this morning come from Martin Luther King, just his sermons and reflections and ideas and speeches. And I think we would all agree that we need more voices of eldership, of leadership, calling us to our best selves, really, in a spirit of service. So that was floating around in my mind today, or this week. And I thought it would be interesting. Last week I tried to give a talk that was sort of about the star of genius that's born at the beginning of life. If you weren't here, you can listen to it online. So what happens like as the star of an infant's life is born? What is that trajectory, that aim, that thread? And then I thought this week I'd look at the end. what does the end of a life look like? And the traditional image of that is the elder. And that's a male and female thing in my mind. We had a brief discussion about that beforehand. I just mean the voices of wisdom in our culture. So I kind of wanted to go birth to death. And why? In part because, to come back to some of the Terra themes, Earth themes, one of the things I mentioned in December was the North, which is also a kind of archetype, and we looked at that archetypal map. The image of that is the elder. There's something about the winter season that pokes around in this, because the elder, of course, has a long-term vision of things, is the kind of person that's been around long enough that knows how to survive winter and knows what kind of things are germinating beneath the soil. So that's kind of the territory I want to explore this morning. And I want to do it by telling 3 stories. The first is a dream. Okay? And by the way, when Kevin, when you were just mentioned that I have a dream speech, it reminded me actually of a verse in the Bible from the prophet Joel. He said, someday the Spirit will fall on men and women, and they will prophesy, and old men and old women will dream dreams. I thought, man, that's an incredible sort of image. And I wondered, I mean, Martin Luther King, of course, deeply versed in, he was really a theologian first. I wonder if I have a dream was somehow also rooted in this larger tradition, this deeper tradition. But anyway, I too had a dream, and this is an actual dream. So I'm on a park bench, and I'm sitting there, and someone is next to me, and I can't, they're really kind of hard to make out, and to my right is my own garden. And it's kind of in the distance, my own garden. And to my left is Donald Trump. And did you say terrible? Oh, our hero. I thought you said terrible. I want to say some things about dreams and how I work with them. But anyway, Trump is on my left, and he's on a throne. Okay? And he's kind of leaning forward in his chair, in his throne-like chair, and he's very kind of certain. That's sort of his energy. He's sort of saying this is what needs to happen. Or he's not saying anything, it's more of his energy. Something needs to happen. And then from my garden, these servants are carrying a tray. And on this tray is an heirloom tomato. I think, oh, amazing. They have one of my heirloom tomatoes, and they're bringing it to Trump. And that's what he needs to sort of, that's the feeling of the dream. He needs this tomato, because you know how it is being president, you need a tomato, and to put on the hamburgers that you provide for people. So anyway, he's carrying this, their servants are carrying this tomato, and as it passes me, I notice that one side is rotten, and one side is pristine. And they bring it over to Trump, and he turns and looks at me and points at his finger at me, almost like he's pointing his chest at me, or pointing his finger in my chest and says, "You." And then I wake up. Okay? Yeah, it's a good dream. It's a good dream. And I mean, this isn't a dream work session, but I'll just give you a couple of ways that I've been working with dreams and thinking about dreams for quite some time. And in most general sense, I'm sort of in the Jungian tradition of dreams, which is something like this. The characters in a dream are manifestations of my own psyche, coming to me in forms and images that I recognize. Which is a nice way of saying this dream probably has nothing to do with Trump directly, but rather the image hooks me in some way, so I recognize the repressed or hidden archetypal and energetic qualities that are in my own psyche. That's the way I like to work with dreams. So I find this dream rather disturbing. What's going on? And another terrain of dreams actually has to do with a fancy word, which is archetype. An archetype is just a pattern. It's usually a way of another way of saying an archetype. It's a pattern of truth that emerges over time. Elder, for example, is an archetype. King is an archetype. It's not fixed somewhere with one individual, but it's part of a long stream that feeds its meaning. So in a dream like this, here you have Trump on a throne. So that's a king image. That's a leader image. Maybe even an elder kind of image, though that's a little blurry, but elder, king, that's sort of the energy of this dream. So I thought, I had a kind of king-like dream. And here in the king-like dream, in order for the king to do what the king needs to do, he needs a tomato, and that tomato is half rotten and half pristine. I thought, okay, that too. And then the heirloom, it's an heirloom tomato. Now I'm getting deep into the weeds of my own dream. So, and I'm not going to do a whole dream interpretation. I'm just throwing it out as a kind of image to sort of wrestle with a little bit. The other thing I'd like to say about dreams is they can have a transpersonal quality. I think the way I work with them is first the personal. How is this related to my own energies? And then I think you can ask something like, what are the transpersonal elements of this? Meaning the larger patterns. Does this say anything about the state of the world? Or the state of kingship, eldership, leadership in general? What does it say about the heirloom, the ancient gifts of the earth? And why do these ancient gifts of the earth have a rotten side and a pristine side? So there might be something personal in there, but it might also be transpersonal. Might give us hints or clues about the nature of reality. So that's story number one. Okay? So I have this dream, and I file it away, and this one actually disturbed me enough where I called a friend of mine who does dream work, and I said, I need to talk to you about something. So we went for a walk. We dove into this dream a bit deeper. And another thing I think about dreams is that they work on you, or they work on the ego, they work on the waking self. And if you sit with them long enough and chew on them and let them have their way, they sometimes will give you little gifts. So anyway, I'm chewing on this dream for a while, and I turned on a podcast about 2-ish months later, a Michael Meade podcast. Michael Meade is a mythologist, storyteller. You should check him out. He's got a very accessible podcast called Living Myth. And he says, I want to tell you a story. And sometimes he tells these stories with drums, which is like really awesome. So he's drumming and telling the story, which I will not be doing this morning. I can barely do this and talk. And here's the story. Here's a version of the story. So a brother and sister are out for a walk one day in a field. And it's sort of the transitional time period, and spring is approaching. The light is getting a little longer, and hints of spring are in the air. And they're walking across this field, and sure enough, at the very end of the field, they see their father. There he is standing there. He's kind of got a glow to him. And they're shocked, this brother and sister, because their father died a few years ago. And they're orphans. And the father just gives a simple gesture and says, come on. So sort of course, they're going to follow their father. What's going on in this strange scene? So they begin to follow their father, and their father takes them to the edge of the field and into a kind of cave. And they follow down into a cave, and in the cave there's a kind of path. And the father keeps gesturing, and they keep descending, until it becomes a kind of road, and they realize they're underground. They're under the earth. And they're following their father under the earth until they come to a village. The brother and sister look at one another, and they know they're in the village that's beneath the village. They're in the village under the earth that is like the village above the earth, and they've never been to such a place. And their father says something very simple. I've taken you to the village of the underworld, the village beneath the village, and I want you to learn some things. I want you to hide in this bush, because you really shouldn't be here in the first place, but whatever, it's a myth. So hide here in this little bush, and I want you to watch and see what happens, and then I'll come back to you and ask you, what did you learn? What did you see? What happened to you? So sure enough, the brother and sister look at one another and wanting to be sort of good kids and follow their father. And after all, they're in the underworld, and their father has been dead for a few years, and they're still a bit confused. They hide in the bush. Their father goes away. And sure enough, out in the village, which you can see out in front of you, a crowd begins to gather. The crowd gathers, And something like the chief or the king or the elder of the town, the leader, shows up and comes sort of in the middle, and the crowd sort of parts. And as the chief, elder, king turns, they see that his body on one side is filled with rotten flesh and maggots. And the maggots are crawling up and down, eating the rotten flesh. And the crowd begins to do their part. They gather around the king and they help the maggots by taking little bits of rotten flesh from the side of the king. Lovely story. I can see your faces. If you're watching on Facebook, I can't see your faces. But they take little bits of rotten flesh, and it's in a way they can see that the maggots are cleaning up what's rotten. And then the king turns, and the crowd comes back together, and he leaves. And at this point, this is taken all day, and night is falling, and they're not really sure what to do. This brother and the sister, they're like, "Where's Dad? We haven't seen him. How do we get back? Was that what we were supposed to see?" And they're a bit confused. And the sun, sure enough, comes up after hiding all night in the bush. The sun comes up, and sure enough, the crowd begins to gather at daybreak, and here comes the king again, the elder and the chief and the leader of the town. He comes back in, and he turns, but this time he's facing the other way, and they can see on the other side of his body is all golden. And the crowd begins to get oil and towels, and they begin to shine the gold and anoint the gold and buff it up and make it very pretty. And then just like before, the king leaves the center of the village, and the crowd sort of disperses, and Father shows up, and Father says, "What'd you see?" And of course the brother and sisters say, "Well, you're not going to believe it. We saw the king, and we saw him come to the center, and we saw that one side of his body is filled with rotten flesh and maggots, and the other is filled with gold." And the father thinks, okay. "Well, I'm sorry you came on this day. I wish you would have come just on the golden day, but you came on the rotten day, and I hate to tell you, but now you know. Now you know what life is really like, and actually things aren't going to be that easy for you at this point. Why don't you follow me? And now you can't stay in the underworld now that you've seen such a thing. It's time to go back home. I wish you would have come just on the golden day, but you came on the rotten day, and I didn't realize. I should have thought about that ahead of time, but now you know what it's like." In a way, he takes them back into the field, and they return to the village. So what is this story about? What's this story about? Now, when I heard this story, what? How did I have a dream about a king? In this case, something very ancient being carried to this king, that one side was rotten and the other side is pristine. It's of a kind of strange synchronicity in my life. I thought, okay, there's something here that's personal, which I won't talk about. It's, I guess, for my therapist. And then there's something transpersonal. There's something that is much older than a dream. And how old is this story? No one knows. But there are some major clues to a question like, what makes a true leader? What makes a true elder? And even, what makes a true king? And the image is very straightforward. One half is rotten, and the other half is golden. And if you want to put it in terms of Jungian psychology, depth psychology, you would say, wherever the wound is, there is the gift. Even though deep within each person there is some rottenness, which no one likes to really, we tend to go in polar opposites. We tend to say, human beings are amazing, pristine, pure, and the problem is the education system, the politics, and if they would have not been exposed to any of the bad stuff, they would have remained pristine and pure. Or we go in the opposite direction, which human beings are crap, and they're rotten to the core, and so forth and so on. This old image says both. But the image of rottenness isn't just rotten. What's happening in the story? The maggots are doing their part to clean what's rotten. I know we don't have a very favorable, view of maggots. You don't go into the principal's office and where they have those posters, it's like success and there's an eagle, there's not like a maggot. It's like, clean your wounds, it's like, but that would be more true. The maggots are the healers. They're unafraid of the rotten flesh. And they know to spend time down in there cleaning out what's dead only helps the flip side, which is what's golden. So if we just hear this story on purely the individual level, and we start to ask a question like, what makes a good elder, a good leader? There's some relationship between their rotten side and the capacity to face the rottenness and begin the path of healing, and their golden side, which is their ability to pass on wisdom and leadership and justice and service. Somehow they're related. How do we ever get to the place where we expected kind of either perfection from people or, well, everybody's rotten in politics, so we might as well get the most rotten person in there. What does it matter anyway? See, feel those two extremes? We do leaders a great disservice when we put them up and build them up and whitewash everything, because the moment we find out something negative, then we say, we have dismissed them altogether. That's the old image, the deep image, the archetypal image, is that deep within every person you have this kind of divide that is related. So, you want to be a good elder? Clean your wounds. Hire a therapist, or any version thereof. We would say it in modern terms, we'd say you have to do your work. And if you cannot face some of that stuff, it limits the golden side. If you're unable, I was thinking about, for some reason this makes me laugh, but it would make me laugh if anyone who would say this. But Trump was asked what grade he would give himself, and he said an A+. That is someone who's unwilling to let the maggots have their way. Would you give yourself an A+ on life? Not really. I hope not. If not, Bob is available afterwards. He's a counselor. He can sit down with you. But one reason why I love this image of the rotten tomato and the rotten chief, king, gold, is because it's much more realistic. It's much more realistic. It's kind of humbling. All right. We're all like this. And if I want to grow up into someone like a Martin Luther King, I'm going to have to face my own stuff. I really am. I have to humble myself and let the maggots have their way. And in doing so, it's like it buffers the possibility and seeds of my own life for my own greatness, which Martin Luther King says every person can be great. And he roots greatness in service, which is a humbling act in and of itself. I'm here for the benefit, not just of myself, but for other people. My life is not all about me, in other words. You get something like that message. That clock is wrong, I realize. I got one more story. So, what was the name of the guy who got arrested this week? Roger Stone. Okay, I never heard of him before. Rolling Stones, heard of them, not Roger Stone. Anyway, he got arrested this week, and he said something that caught my attention. And he said, whatever, he's being interviewed, and he said, "I will not bear false witness against the president." I thought, this is too good. First of all, this is the thing he's being accused of, basically, and it's just kind of a weird twist. Also, that's one of the 10 Commandments. Don't bear false testimony against your neighbor, which is the backbone of society. I mean, might not be into the Bible or whatever, but take that out, and you have a society. Then you have a society that you can't trust what people say, and people get imprisoned for things they didn't do. So that's a measure of a good society. So if you have leaders who are bearing false testimony, you're in real trouble. And it reminded me of a story in the Bible. And the story is about a king named Ahab. Ahab was not, the Bible is sort of anti-Ahab. He had a foreign wife named Jezebel, and he gets criticized by the prophets. And from an archaeological point of view, he was one of the most successful kings, interestingly enough, in terms of building projects. But anyway, King Ahab wakes up one day and says, I want this vineyard that belongs to a guy named Naboth. Okay? And he goes to Naboth and says, I want your vineyard because I want a vegetable garden. And Naboth said, nah, you can't have it. It's my family's, you can't have it. So in the story, Ahab gets depressed. Really, he goes and he lays down, and he curls up in the fetal position. His wife like, what? I'm serious. He's like, what's wrong? And he tells Jezebel what the problem is. She's like, don't worry about it. Get up. Take care of yourself. I'll take care of this particular problem. So she holds a feast. She invites Naboth. And she says, let's put him at the head of the table. And she invites the elders. You can't make this stuff up. She invites the elders of the town to the meeting and tells the elders to bear false testimony against Naboth that he's committed a crime against God and against the king. So they do. They say, Naboth's a bad dude. He's spoken ill of the king and of God. They say, let's stone him. They take him outside. They throw rocks at him. He dies. She goes home to Ahab and says, Ahab, vineyard is yours. He's like, yes! Goes out there to take possession of the vineyard, but Elijah shows up, the prophet. And he says, he says, Ahab, just like the dogs licked up Naboth's blood, so they will lick up yours and Jezebel's. Have a nice day. I love this story for multiple reasons. But it's a story about what is a king really like. And if you have a society and a structure that allows for things like greed to have its way, power to be the only measure of success, if there's no internal cleaning, if there's no maggots cleaning up the rotten side, then you end up with this kind of leadership that says, I'm going to take what's mine whenever I want, and anyone that gets in my way, I simply falsely accuse, say they're lying, and nick them off, I would say, in good British parlance. Take them out. And this just a bit of a side about this story. One of the things I think is interesting that's going on in our culture is that, I'll pick on the evangelicals because that was my heritage, all right? Many evangelicals think Trump is a great guy, and leadership is put there by God and so forth and so on. In a sense, haven't read their own stories. Haven't read their own stories. And there's something very interesting that runs like a thread through the entire Bible, which is this. The measure of a good society is how it treats the poor, the widow, the alien, the orphan, and the immigrant. That's that prophetic voice that cuts like a knife. That's Martin Luther King, saying the measure of a good society is how it treats the poor, the widow, the alien, the orphan, the oppressed, the immigrant, the black, the Native American, and you fill in the blank. That's the measure. And without that kind of counter-cultural cutting, what ends up happening is that the people at the top circle the wagons around power and greed. So you need this kind of like tension between sort of the prophetic voice and the king-like voice. So, where do we go with such a story like this? In other words, the Ahab story gives us a little clue that the bias from the bottom matters. Bias from the bottom actually matters very much. So I want to do a little crowdsourcing in the short amount of time we have left. Then I'll say a few closing comments. I want you to, in your little groups that you're sort of sitting in, I want you to turn around and just have a conversation that's forward thinking. And here's the question: what makes a good elder? The qualities. Have a little conversation and then report back, and we'll see what kind of themes we come up. Go. Okay. Okay, let's regroup. I'm sure you're all done and have settled it. The final word has been spoken. So, you tell me, characteristics. What came up? Tell me. Vision. Listen. Time. Okay, yeah, sense of time. What else? Experience. Non-dualistic. Okay. Action, compassion, self-reflection, empathy. Admit that you're wrong. That's that, tomato business. Yeah. What else? Thinking for ourselves. What's that mean exactly? Okay, so a certain capacity of autonomy or individuation, we could say. Not just going along with the party line. Okay, what else? Sorry, what? Vulnerable. Okay. Actually, I like this image. I mean, vulnerable has become a real popular thing. It's sort of like, as long as you're vulnerable, then you're telling the truth. It's sort of how it's coming out in popular culture. But there's a measure of vulnerability in this story. Think about that king allowing the cleaning of the wounds to happen. And the maggots and also the people helping out. Yeah, that's quite a vulnerable place to be. Anything else? Okay, a dream for the future. I think that's particularly true in the king vein here, for sure. Okay. One reason why I love working with archetypes is because I probably could have made a similar list and it would have matched your list. Do you see how even these things are they seem to be woven into a kind of tapestry? See, we know, I think we do live in a culture that's growing increasingly elderless. Really. Where is the wisdom, we might ask? But we know what we need. All we have to do is crowdsource it. And I think similar kinds of things, you could have taken a group of high school kids and they would have come up with similar kinds of things. Why? Because it's deep in the psyche. We know. We've just forgotten. And we've forgotten what that path looks like. I'll add a few things, I think, about personal integrity that come out of these stories that I was telling. Kind of personal integrity. It's kind of, yes, I have two natures. And taking responsibility for that. I would add taking ethical and moral responsibility for oneself and for the community. Maybe in concentric circles, starting with the individual, I'm taking responsibility for myself, and then for my family, and then for my neighborhood, and then for my community, and then for the earth itself. Some of the biggest elders I know are earth elders. Really. That's how far out the circle of inclusion goes. I think a theme that is worth mentioning is some kind of personal sacrifice for the sake of the whole. You hear that particularly in Martin Luther King's words. Some kind of personal sacrifice. At the end of the day, it's not just me and my stuff that I collected. Somehow the turn is towards something else. And I think one interesting thing that comes out of the Ahab story, which is one eye on the top and one eye on the bottom. Maybe it's to a certain extent that's very difficult. Maybe that's why in the old world you needed the prophet to come in from the outside and cut the thing down. But one eye on the top, which means you do have to think about budget and structures and systems, and you have to have one eye on the bottom, which is, and how do those budget structures, systems, and power hierarchies affect those who are on the bottom? The baby agrees. I can tell, I speak baby. And finally, I'll just end with this, which is talk about another kind of elder, which is Gandhi. He says, be the change. You want more elders? You're it. Okay? And me too. As an archetypal energy, something to live into. You don't go to elder camp that's like weekend, like 12 steps to become an elder, and then you're done. No, I realize, just like the cleaning of the wounds takes time. But we need more in our culture, so we're it. And hopefully, as we embody that, it begins to change the nature of the culture and the nature of the conversation that we're having as a culture back toward things that are aspirational and good and beautiful and just and merciful. That's what I got to say today. Thanks for listening.